They found the first ledger nailed open beneath the tongue of the church bell, its pages fanned like a fresh wound, ink still wet enough to stain the frost that had crept across the belfry floor during the night watch. The sexton swore he had locked the tower at Compline, yet there the thing waited, spine cracked backward, print exhaling a metallic sweetness that reminded the old man of the blood-tinged snow outside field of the 40-foot where the rebel bones had lain unburied since '45. I was summoned before sunrise, still wrapped in the soot smell of my own hearth, boots unbuckled, fingers smelling of the tallow I had been melting to seal a client's will. The parson pressed the ledger into my arms without speaking, and I felt the parchment throbbing, or imagined I did, like a distant artery against the thin wool of my coat. The ink had not frozen. Instead, it glistened, black as the creosote that collects inside a chimney throat, and when I tilted the page toward the lantern, the characters seemed to slide, rearranging themselves into a pattern my eyes refused to hold steady, the way one cannot hold the shape of grief in the mind at the moment it arrives. I read the opening line aloud without meaning to. In the year of our Lord, 1763, I, Thaddeus Graysmark, solicitor of this parish, do set down the method by which souls are bound to service beyond the term of natural life. And the bell above us gave a single twitch, not a full peal, only the shudder of a sleeper who hears his name called from another room. The parson's breath clouded between us, carrying the sourness of night-long vigil, and I understood that the document was addressed to me alone, that its placement in the tower was not sacrilege, but invitation, the way a noose invites the neck by merely hanging from a beam. I carried the ledger home through lanes already bruised by cart ruts, past cottages whose windows were blind with frost, past the workhouse where the paupers coughed in unison like a chained choir, and every footstep I took seemed echoed by a second, softer step that kept perfect time, though when I turned the lane was empty save for a hair frozen upright, eyes reflecting the first gray slice of dawn. By the time I closed my study door, the ledger had dried enough to stick to my palms. When I peeled it free, the skin came with it, a fleck of myself grafted to the confession, and I knew, though reason protested, that the bargain the pages proposed had already begun. Ink feeding on flesh, the way mildew feeds on scripture left too long in a drowned church. I was born in the final year of King George's War, the year the Ohio forests were said to have screamed for 3 nights without cease. My mother pushed me out under a blood-daubed moon, while the midwife muttered charms against Pontiac's name. And perhaps that is why I have always felt history pressing at the back of my skull like the point of a bayonet held by a patient soldier who can afford to wait. Our house stood 3 miles from the turnpike, beyond the last ridge plowed straight as a Puritan conscience, where the wind arrives already tasting of bones that lie unshriven in the bogs. Father raised flax and children with equal severity, teaching us that a field is merely another kind of ledger, every seed a debit, every stalk a credit, and the frost keeps its own accounts in a hand none may read. When I was 12, the neighbor's eldest walked into the marsh one November dusk, boots still laced, cap missing, and they dragged the mere for a week, hauling up only a wooden cradle not seen in the parish since the famine of '30, its interior scarred by fingernails that had grown, curled, and died long before the boy was born. After that, I began to dream of ledgers whose margins bled and to wake with the taste of iron ink on my tongue. At 18, I apprenticed to Thaddeus Graysmark, drafter of wills and cataloger of debts, a man whose voice never rose above the hush of ashes settling. He taught me that the law is a quieter monster than canon, but slower to leave the field, and that every signature is a small suicide of the will. We worked by tallow lamp in a room whose only window faced the prison yard, so that our labors were silhouetted against the creeping shadows of debtors pacing their circle, and I learned to distinguish the rustle of parchment from the rustle of a man dropping his coat to be flogged, until both sounds braided together in the chambers of my ear. Pia sin pararissim new. I took his seat, dipped his pen, and for 20 years I wrote names beneath names, transferring acreage, tithes, and bastards with the indifferent grace of a gravedigger measuring his rope, until the parish grew quiet around me, as though it had been entombed in the very ink I spilled. The autumn before the ledger appeared, the crops refused to yellow. Instead, they blackened from the root upward, the stalks retaining their shape but crumbling at touch into a powder that smelled faintly of communion wafers left to spoil. Horses grew reluctant to pass the churchyard gate, nostrils flaring at nothing, eyes rolling until the whites showed like cracked porcelain. One mare collapsed, and when we opened her, the heart was found wrapped in a filament of ink-colored thread that disintegrated in daylight but reformed in shadow, coiling as if guided by an unseen clerk. Children began to play a game called signing, tracing crosses on each other's forearms with sharpened straw, chanting a rhyme whose words were older than any cottage, older perhaps than the ridge itself, and those who were marked woke the next morning with palms stained the precise shade of drying parchment. The parson consulted the bishop. The bishop sent a curate versed in modern agriculture. The curate recommended lime, prayer, and crop rotation, but the lime turned black within hours of scattering. The prayers emerged from the vicar's mouth as visible breath that lingered in the nave, like a congregant who refuses to leave. And the crops, when rotated, returned to their original rows overnight, as though the field itself remembered a more ancient deed. It was then I started to hear the scratching, not within the walls but within the transactions I drafted. A faint abrasion, as if the pen were protesting each signature, and if I held the parchment to the firelight, I could see a second hand beneath mine, guiding the strokes, teaching the ink to form loops that resembled shackles more than letters. I told no one, for a solicitor learns early that confession is only another deed to be witnessed and filed. Yet I began to keep my own private ledger, recording the dates and names of every client whose eyes, during our interview, flickered for an instant with the recognition one gives to a creditor encountered in a dream. Then came the night of All Hallows, when the wind arrived carrying the smell of freshly turned ledgers, a dry, papery scent that made the watchdog whimper and crawl beneath the pew. I sat alone copying a mortgage that would transfer the last freeholding farm to a cotton consortium in Manchester, and as I wrote the final clause, the candle guttered blue, casting the room in the color of bruised conscience. The ink thickened, resisting the nib, and when I pressed harder, the pen split, releasing a clot that unfolded upon the page into a perfect miniature of the farm in question, complete with tiny animated laborers who moved across the fields harvesting nothing, their scythes sweeping through air that, even in the drawing, looked starved. The words dried instantly, and the parchment contracted as though inhaling, pulling my palm flat against the page until the lines of the deed printed themselves into my skin, a violet lattice that throbbed with the same rhythm I had heard in the bell tower months later when the ledger was found. I tore free, fled the room, plunged my hand into the rain barrel and scrubbed until the water turned black. But the lattice only deepened, acquiring the hue of old blood under parchment, and when I returned the document had vanished, leaving on the desk a single iron gall pellet that tasted, when I lifted it to my tongue, of every signature I had ever forced from a debtor. Sleep that night was a corridor whose walls were pages. I walked between them while unseen clerks on the far side wrote from the inside outward the nib points pushing through the paper like blind worms, and whenever I tried to read what was being inscribed, the letters dissolved into the sound of coins dropping into a box that never ceased filling. At dawn, the parson's messenger arrived, white-lipped, summoning me to the tower, and I understood that the confession now waiting in the frost was not the beginning of my trial, but its final entry, the last debit posted before the account is closed. I climbed the tower stairs with the ledger clasped beneath my coat, each step printing the lattice of my palm against the page so that the parchment drank the heat of my body, the way blotting paper drinks a confession. The stone spiral was darker than the inside of a lung, and the air carried the sweet iron stink of the bell rope, which looked disturbingly like a noose that had learned patience. At the landing, the sexton waited, lantern trembling in his fist, his eyes reflecting the narrow slit of sky behind me in such a way that I seemed to be staring out of his head rather than in, as though the world had inverted and I was the one imprisoned in a skull of stone. He whispered that the bell had spoken once more while I was en route, not a peal but a syllable, a wet click between tongue and palate, and though he knew no Latin, he swore the sound had meant witness, pronounced in the accusative, the form used for a man already sentenced. I sent him down, for a confession must be received alone, and when his footfalls faded, I set the ledger on the belfry rail where frost had etched a perfect ledger of its own, every crystal a debit against the coming thaw. The pages opened of themselves to the second leaf, and I saw that my name had already been inscribed at the top in the same ink that pulsed beneath my skin, the strokes so fresh they bled outward in hair-fine roots that searched the parchment for purchase. Beneath the heading waited a blankness more terrible than any accusation, an emptiness that seemed to inhale, drawing the warmth from my face until the tears that gathered at the ducts chilled and hardened like tiny glass beads. I understood that the story I was about to write was already written, that the only liberty left to me lay in the choice of ink, my own blood or another's, and even that choice had been forecast in the earlier hand. Which discovered still in my cuff where it had lodged like a splinter of fate, and began to transcribe the events that follow. My letters, the tall split and pen thin, as though modeled on the bars of a cage. As I wrote, the discovered still in my sway where it had lodged wind spulled thee, that nib follow, my letters great bronze above me and with a faint thin throb, as though the metal mottled contained a on, darker the confession of once a, Cage progressed with the Inev wrote, of the a debtors swayed, though each paragraph another week at closer each to foreclosure of the great bronze, and above I me felt the with pages a thickened faint arterial throb, as if the metal itself contained a second darker beneath. The confession, once begun, hand progressed with the heavier Inev not it but ability, with of a debtor's weight calendar of days each extracted from owners who another had week closer to foreclosure, and yet I felt the pages thicken beneath myos handest. Growing heavier, not with ink but with a weight of days, becomes extracted collateral from one must first understand not the yet mortgage of 1748, the year the river changed its mind and began to flow backward every seventh night, carrying 1748. Of the mill's year upstream, the whose river changed, had its already mind, and began to flow backward every seventh night, carrying with it the refuse were of drafted mills in upstream, my whose master owners' had hand already, signed, and away I there. A right boys of to 14 stood in the Liverpool window, watching that the deeds current were reverse drafted, while in Eli Myas explains hand that property I, merely boy time of made 14 negot, Abel stood at. a method of the charging current reverse while rent Eli for as the crime of property arriving. Time made negotiable, a did method of charging the future rent for the gratitude crime shown of to arriving who. Offer to. The am farmer's put who accepted those loans did so with the same dazed gratitude shown to surgeon's wax who already offered to am there putate before bodies, the gang andrine, the declares wax accepted the print the way mud seals accepts into the hoof wax, already closing warm over from there, the mark own until bodies only, a scar the remained wax, accepted the print. The conque avity mud looked accepts like the hoof absence, of closing a over coin the mark until only a perceived scar remained. I a smooth concavity perceived that until looked like the absence of a candle coin. Was that none the perceived mortgages contained, what a clause written in not the perceived space between the lines, a vacancy until that waited night to be the tenanted candle by whatever creditor was might that step the forward mortgages once contained the signatories written had been spacicted between from their lines own, a vacancy that waited to be in a syntax older than freehold, older tenanted by than whatever the creditor idea might of step ownership forward. Once, and it stipulated that the debtor zicted from interest their own skins should. Rue the clause was after written in the death syntax of than the free body hold, older perhaps than the idea of ownership compounded, and by it the stipulated breath that of the heirs debtor ands the uninterest born. Should continue. I copied those documents even without trem after the death of the had. Taught me compounded by conscience, the is breath only of another, and the unborn to be, I copied, and those reset for the law had a disputed taught pasture me, that conscience is only another form. The oven tail flowing uphill through the veins of the sleepers, and I woke with the taste of night wet. I parchment dreamed in of the river flowing uphill through the veins of the sleepers, and I woke with the taste to inventory parchment, the in estate mouth. In flavor variably, that the inventory revealed whenever a client died in testfolate, and IA was missing called to inventory, the estate vanished heirloom. A child the whose revealed a shortfall. A missing acre, a vanished heirloom, a child whose provdenning had been edges recorded, but these whose shortages shadow, when a measured separate against column the wall, proved translucent at the edges. These titled shortages were rem entered ain into der a to separate the column holder whose heading and I the never total recalled at writing the bottom a column increased, titled with rem thein steadier appetite to of the holder grave that has, and the total at the bottom increased with the steady appetite of a grave that has learned to digest. Births. By 1755, the parish register began to mirror my secret ledger. Births outnumbered by deaths, marriages by bankruptcies, and each deficit was matched by a corresponding surplus in the column of remainder, until the figures achieved a grotesque equilibrium, a balance maintained by what I can only describe as the extraction of possibility itself. It was then that I first heard the scratching within the walls, not the scurry of mice but the deliberate abrasion of quill on plaster, as though some clerk were copying the deed of the house onto its own bones. I searched and found nothing, yet the next morning the wallpaper had darkened in stripes exactly the width of ledger margins, and when I pressed my ear to those stripes, I heard the faint clink of distant coins dropping into a box that never ceased filling. He offered to reconcile the town's accounts with the colony, to translate acres into pounds sterling and souls into indentures, and the selectmen, weary of arithmetic that never balanced, accepted his terms. The document he produced was sealed with wax mixed from the tallow of executed witches and the red ochre used to mark trees on the frontier, a compound that never entirely cooled, remaining pliant enough to accept fresh impressions for centuries. Local diaries record that the night the covenant was signed, the temperature dropped until breath fell to the ground and shattered, and those who stepped outside found their silhouettes frozen upright, lingering like dismissed servants. In the morning, the silhouettes were gone, but the frost retained their outlines, and for years afterward, children could trace the absent profiles with their fingers, learning the shape of eviction before they learned their letters. Increase. Mather Graysmark departed before thaw, leaving behind a strongbox that could not be opened, and a clause that required every seventh son to serve as keeper of the balance, a post that passed from father to son with the same inevitability as clubfoot or madness. The office carried no salary, only the right to draft contracts in the name of the holder, whoever or whatever that creditor might be, and to collect the interest that accrued in the currency of days, dreams, and the space between heartbeats. My grandfather inherited the post in 1719, the year smallpox closed the town like a book slammed shut. He performed his duties with the resignation of a man born under a lien, and when he died, the skin of his chest was found to be printed with the entire text of the covenant, reversed as though the words had grown inward, a living palimpsest that buried itself with him. My father, reluctant heir, tried to refuse the office, but the moment he spoke the refusal his tongue blistered into the shape of a seal, the ridges forming the word forfeit, and from that day he could taste nothing but the copper flavor of unpaid debt. He lasted 6 years, then walked into the same marsh that would later claim the neighbor's boy, and though they dragged the mere, they found only a strongbox identical to the first, its lock now gaping open, the interior lined with fresh parchment that accepted my footprints when I stepped close to identify the body that was not there. Thus, the post descended to me, Thaddeus, in 1743, and I accepted it with the fatalism of a man who discovers that his own signature has already been appended to the contract of his life. I dipped the iron-nibbed pen my master left, and I began to write, unaware that the ink was drawn from a reservoir deeper than any well, a darkness that measured its withdrawals not in quarts, but in quorums of the living. By the time the crops blackened and the bell began to speak, the parish had become a palimpsest overwritten so many times that the original text of the land, its rivers, its stones, its ungovernable weather, had been all but erased. In its place stood a replica assembled from mortgages, quitclaims, and the fine print of extinction. The holder's credit had swollen to encompass not only acreage but seasons. Spring itself was collateral, and the interest it paid took the form of a frost that returned each May, nipping buds with the precision of a clerk subtracting shillings. Summer was mortgaged for its heat, which arrived in such concentrated parcels that livestock collapsed, their hides branded with the same lattice that now decorated my palm. Autumn, of course, belonged to the harvest of souls, and the reaping was done not with scythes, but with signatures, each name a seed that sprouted in the soil beneath the churchyard, germinating into silhouettes that stood upright beneath the turf, waiting for the final foreclosure when they would break surface and claim the debt of bodies. Winter was the auditor's season, when the books were balanced by the simple expedient of erasing whatever refused to tally. Snow fell selectively, covering only the houses whose occupants had fallen short in their payments of breath, and beneath that whiteness the holder walked, auditing the heartbeat of every sleeper, pressing an ear to the rib cage the way a landlord presses an ear to a wall to determine if the tenant still resides within, It was during such a winter, 1762, that I first encountered the woman who would become the final entry in the confession, though I did not know her name and would never learn it. She appeared at my office wrapped in a cloak the color of unpaid rent, her face a paleness so complete that the pupils seemed to float like twin debts, unanchored by collateral. She asked no questions, only placed before me a document already drafted in a hand identical to mine, yet dated 3 days in the future, a deed that transferred custody of an unborn child to the holder of the balance in exchange for the remission of all prior claims upon the parish. The signature line bore my name, perfectly counterfeited, and beneath it the seal of the covenant, still warm, still weeping that ochre-red tear that never congeals. I refused, or believed I refused, but the moment the pen touched the page, the refusal reversed itself, looping into an affirmation that signed away not only the child, but the concept of childhood itself, removing it from the lexicon of the possible the way a forfeited farm is removed from the map, leaving behind a white space that gazes back at the traveler like a cataract in the eye of God. She departed without sound, leaving only the smell of ink that had never been allowed to dry. And 3 nights later the child was born dead, though the mother survived long enough to whisper before her own pulse was entered as interest that she had felt the infant extracted not through the birth canal, but through the page of a book held open above her womb, the paper rustling with the appetite of a ledger that balances itself by consuming the item that refuses to fit. I recorded the death in the parish register and simultaneously in the secret ledger, where the infant's name, never spoken, appeared in red, the color of overdue accounts. The column of remainder swelled by exactly 9 months of unlived days, and the equilibrium was restored, though the bell in the tower gave a single cracked note that rang out across the frost like a summons to a congregation that had already departed. It was then I understood that the confession I would one day write was not a revelation, but a receipt, an acknowledgment that the debt had been paid not by me but through me, the way a field pays its tithe by yielding up the wheat without ever understanding the arithmetic of the sickle. All that remained was to await the night when the ledger would be returned, nailed open beneath the tongue of the bell, and to inscribe the final entry that would transfer the balance of my own soul into the column marked forfeit, thereby closing the account and leaving the parish to discover, in the silence that followed, that the true horror lies not in being haunted, but in being collected. Yet even this knowledge did not prepare me for the moment, now at hand, when the pages before me in the tower begin to turn of themselves, flipping backward toward the blank space where my confession must end and the reader's begin. For the holder collects not only what is owed, but what is witnessed. And whoever reads these words inherits the debt the way a man inherits the shape of his own coffin, already measured, already planed, waiting only to be paid for in the currency of days. I dip the pen once more, the ink now so thick it resembles clotted midnight, and I write what must be written, not to absolve myself. Absolution is a coin the holder does not accept, but to extend the ledger beyond the span of my own ribs, to pass the balance forward like a candle that burns not with tallow, but with the reader's name, already guttering at the edge of the wick. The bell above me inhales, preparing its final syllable, and I feel the tower tilt slightly, as though the entire structure were a quill poised above a vaster page, waiting for the hand that will complete the sentence begun in 1692, continued in 1748, and concluded, if conclusion is possible, on this frost-bitten morning in 1763, while the ink dries not on parchment, but on the inside of your eyelids, reader, who have followed me this far and are therefore party to the covenant, co-signatory to a debt that compounds with every heartbeat you have not yet spent. The ink, having exhausted the parchment's thirst, begins to drink the plank beneath, soaking into the grain until the wood remembers every letter and will carry the confession long after the page itself has been eaten by the same moths that gnaw the parish shrouds. I watch the letters settle, their legs curling like burned spiders, and I understand that the tower is becoming the ledger, that its beams are being converted into columns of debit and credit, an architecture of obligation that will outlast the stones themselves. I place my palm flat against the beam and feel the lattice in my flesh answer, the two patterns fitting together like a key sliding home. The tower gives a soft sigh, not of surrender, but of satisfaction. The sound a purse makes when the final coin is pressed inside and the drawstring tightens. From below comes the scrape of the sexton returning, but his step is slower now, weighted, as though he walks with the parish on his back. I know without looking that his eyes have already begun to print the confession on the inside of his corneas, that he will carry it to the village and read it aloud in the marketplace, not with voice, but with the simple act of being seen. For the debt is contagious, the way flame is contagious, leaping from pupil to pupil until every beholder becomes a co-signatory. I have no more pages, yet the pen will not lift. It drills onward, scoring the wood, then the thumb I have braced beneath, splitting the nail and injecting ink into the quick so that my own bloodstream becomes the final column, a living red entry that swells until I feel the balance tipping, the surplus of my life pouring out to satisfy the deficit I have spent 40 years accumulating on behalf of the holder. The bell rope sways again more strongly, and I see that it is no longer hemp, but a braid of parchment strips, each strip printed with names too small to read. Yet I know them. Every debtor, every heir, every unborn child whose days were mortgaged before conception. They twist together into a cord that flexes like a muscle, and the bell itself begins to descend, mouth first, a bronze tongue lowering to kiss the crown of my head. I do not flinch. I have signed away the reflex that once jerked the body from danger, traded it for the stillness required to witness the final audit. The rim of the bell settles around my skull like a crown of cooled wax, and the interior is lined with mirror-bright verdigris in which I see reflected not my face but the ledger entire, every entry floating backward until the first word, covenant, touches my forehead and brands me with its chill. The metal begins to speak, not with sound, but with pressure, squeezing the confession out through the pores of my scalp, so that the ink rises like dew, beating on the bronze and running down in rivulets that collect in the gutter of the bell's lip. Each droplet carries a sentence, a paragraph, the entire history of the parish compressed into fluid characters that will rain upon the village when the frost releases its grip, baptizing the sleepers in a black dew that will dry into a script they can never wash from the creases of their palms. The bell lifts, slowly, reluctantly, the way a creditor relinquishes the hand of a debtor who has finally paid. The parchment rope unbraids, releasing a snow of names that drift downward like ash from a heretic's burning. Each name lands without sound, yet I feel them settling on my shoulders. A coat of debtors' signatures that weighs less than breath, but more than memory. I step back from the rail. The tower floor is now entirely printed, beams and planks tattooed with the confession in reverse, so that whoever climbs here hereafter will read the story upward from ground to sky, ascending through my crimes as through a morality play performed on the interior skin of a drum. My palm, when I examine it, is blank. The lattice has migrated to the wood, to the bell, to the air itself, where it drifts like frost smoke, visible only when the eye is angled away. I am unmarked, unburdened, but the emptiness feels heavier than the debt, the way an amputated limb aches not with flesh, but with absence. I descend the stairs. Each tread utters a syllable of my name, splitting it into consonants that linger on the stone like chewed pits. The tower door stands open, and beyond it the village waits under a sky the color of unpaid rent. Roofs bowed beneath the weight of ink that has not yet fallen but already stains the sleeper's dreams. No one accosts me. The sexton is gone, his lantern abandoned, its candle burned down to a blue wafer that exhales the last of its tallow in the shape of a seal. I walk the lane between cottages whose windows are already beginning to print the confession from the inside, letters forming on the glass like frost, readable only from within, so that each inhabitant wakes to find the story crawling across the pane, a private edition that will vanish at sunrise, but remain legible on the retina forever. The smell of ink precedes me, a metallic sweetness that turns the milk sour in the churns, that rusts the horseshoes on the sleeping hooves, that blackens the wool on the backs of sheep until they resemble pages torn from a book no shepherd dares to read. Even the crows overhead lose their voices, their caws emerging as visible puffs of script that dissolve before they can be deciphered, leaving only the punctuation of their absence. Guru. I sit at my desk. The private ledger lies open, its pages now mirrored, reflecting not what I have written, but what will be written by whoever inherits the post. The iron nib pen rests across the gutter, split exactly in half, each half bleeding a different color, one black, one red, into the wood, where they merge into a violet that matches the lattice once carved into my hand. I feel the confession complete itself inside my mouth, the words crawling up the back of my throat like a cough composed of footnotes. I open my lips and the final sentence emerges, not spoken but exhaled, a visible breath that hovers before my face, condensing into a small rectangular pane the size of a creditor's visiting card. On it is printed, in type too fine to endure daylight, the name of the next keeper, the next signature, the next debtor. But the name is yours, reader, and the ink is still wet, and the frost is already climbing the inside of your window, and the bell somewhere overhead is inhaling, and the ledger is opening beneath your tongue, and the balance is waiting to be transferred the moment you close your eyes and admit, if only to yourself, that you have understood every word. I leave the house before dawn can certify what has happened. The lane is empty, yet the ruts brim with a black dew that reflects no stars, mirrors nothing but the inside of the reader's skull, your skull, where the confession now nests behind the optic nerve, laying its eggs in the alphabet of your dreams. At the crossroads, I pause, not from hesitation, but because the ground itself has begun to print upward, the soil extruding letters like frost-seeded grass. Each blade spells a syllable of your name, reader, a name I have never known, yet have always been writing, the way a man carves his own epitaph on the wall of a cell he will never leave. I kneel, press my ear to the dust, and hear the faint clink of coins dropping into a box that never ceases filling. The sound is coming from beneath your ribs, from the purse of days you carry, each heartbeat another shilling deducted, each breath a copper farthing surrendered to the holder who balances the books in the column of your remaining nights. The wind arrives, carrying the smell of ink that has never dried. It tastes of the parchment you will touch tomorrow, of the lease you will sign, of the child whose name you will write in a register somewhere, unaware that every stroke of your pen is a debit against the unspent portion of your own soul. I stand, empty of everything but the story, and begin to walk westward, toward the marsh that swallowed my father, the cradle, the boy, the mare. The ground softens beneath my heels, accepting the print not of feet, but of marginalia. Tiny notes that explain how the debt is transferred not by signature, but by recognition. By the moment you admit, if only in the privacy of your pulse, that this account could be yours. Behind me, the village wakes to find the confession gone from tower and window, gone from hearth and pane. Yet every mirror now reflects a small rectangular absence the size of a visiting card, a blank space that follows the gaze wherever it turns. They will scrub, they will pray, they will burn the glass, but the absence remains, a window through which the holder watches the balance continue. I reach the edge of the mere. The water is black, not with peat, but with ink, and when I step upon it, I do not sink. I stand, supported by the surface tension of every word I have written, a membrane of narrative strong enough to bear the weight of a life already surrendered. The moon, a thin copper disk like a canceled coin, rises behind me. Its light strikes the water and reveals, beneath the skin of ink, the silhouettes of every debtor standing upright, eyes open, mouths shaped around the final entry they were forced to sign. Their faces are yours, reader, arranged in a ledger that balances perfectly because the sum of absence is infinite. I take one step forward, the membrane parts, accepting me the way a page accepts a period. The water closes over without a ripple, and the last thing I see is the reflection of the bell tower miles away, its bronze mouth still lowered, still dripping, still waiting for the next confession to be nailed beneath the tongue of the final witness. Down here, the cold is not temperature but syntax, a grammar that conjugates the verb to owe in every tense except future perfect, for the future is already collateral, and perfection belongs to the holder alone. I sink slowly, feet first, the ink entering my ears, my nostrils, the soft roof of my mouth, filling me with the story that will continue in your voice the moment you speak of what you have read. When my eyes close, they do not go dark. Instead, they open inside your own reader. And the tower is there, the bell, the plank, the pen, the frost, the woman in the cloak, the child extracted through a page. You carry them the way a pocket carries a coin, unaware of its weight until the hand descends to pay. The mere seals above me, leaving only the faintest ripple, a circle that expands until it touches the shore where your footprints will appear tomorrow morning, shaped exactly like the absence of a signature you meant to withhold but somehow gave. Nothing remains on the surface but a small iron gall pellet, round and black, already dissolving into the water, already entering the current that feeds the river, that irrigates the fields, that flows backward every seventh night to collect the interest due. Somewhere overhead the bell gives a final twitch, not a peal, but a punctuation. The sound of an account closed in another country, in another year, in another language you will never speak yet already understand. And now the confession is complete, the balance transferred, the ledger closed, except for the blank line at the bottom where your own name has begun to write itself, slowly, in ink that stays wet forever, waiting for the witness who will inherit the debt the moment you close this page. Close your eyes. Close the account. The water holds me like a full stop. The story holds you like an open bracket. Together we achieve the equilibrium the holder requires, a silence that balances perfectly against the sound of coins dropping into a box that never ceases filling, that never will, that never has.